Well, today's psalm is the last passage in our psalm reflection series that we've been going through over January. We specifically designed this series over January because we feel like it's, as we reflect on the last year, and we look forward to this year, we feel it's appropriate to assess and evaluate our spiritual lives and how we're going with the hard stuff. And when we assess and evaluate our spiritual lives, it's important to deal with the hard stuff. Things like reading your Bible and singing aren't that hard. We know that we need to do it, and it's encouraging and exciting to do. But today's psalm is tough. It's a hard one. It's the kind of psalm that we need to digest, because when we do it, it's going to help us face things that we go through in our lives that could potentially threaten our faith. They could threaten our spiritual lives if we don't know how to deal with things that come up. Because the psalm answers the questions of what to do when you have something that happens that is awful. That is just awful. It might be bad mistreatment in your life. It might be an injustice that happened to you. It could be a tragic event that happens. What are you going to do when something blows up and you're left to pick up the pieces? Psalm 137 is a really important psalm for us to look at, because when we look at the psalms, we usually have this expectation of how a psalm will go. It'll usually be inspiring or encouraging or challenging. But when you read this psalm, there's pain. There's pain that you can't bear. One commentator says of this psalm, every line of it is alive with pain, whose intensity grows with each verse to an appalling climax. Perhaps you heard the psalm read and you haven't fully comprehended what's happening. It has a very specific context that I'm going to explain shortly. But before I do, I just want to say, despite how disturbing we're going to find what lies ahead, this psalm is going to help us go through tragedy, through tragic injustices that we face in life. It's going to help us deal with anger in those moments. It's going to help us to deal with the mistreatment and the feelings that we have that we are left with because of what's happened. And as we go through it, it's going to be really easy to think of real world scenarios as we go along. Things that, you might hear terrorists or war criminals do. So it'll be really tempting to hear the context and think about the bad stuff in the world and kind of go, man, I wish those terrorists would hear this. But can I just ask us, let's start with ourselves. Let's start with our own hearts first. Let's look at how we interact with those who have hurt us, with those who have done injustice against us, and we'll start there. So don't just apply the psalm to not yourself. Make sure that the psalm hits your own heart. So let me give you the context. Now, just a warning, it's not pretty. It's not a pretty context. It's history. It happened. This psalm is an eyewitness account of an event that happened in the history of God's people. It's a painful account of the memories of what happened in the sacking of the city of Jerusalem. So here's the context. The biggest, most powerful nation at the time, Babylon, came against God's people, Judah, and they surrounded and besieged the capital city of Jerusalem. Well, the city fell. The Babylonian soldiers came in and they did what you do when empires take a city. They looted, they pillaged, they left the city in ruins, they destroyed it, they burned it, they killed people along the way. And Judah's neighboring country, Edom, is mentioned in verse 7. When they saw what happened, when they saw that the city was being besieged, they came and watched. And they cheered. Verse 7 says, lay it bare, lay it bare. That's what they were shouting, lay it bare, down to the foundations. You find out more about Edom's sin against God's people in the book of Obadiah, verses 10 to 14, where we see that rather than opening their borders so that the refugees could escape, they responded to God's people with violence. They joined in. They took advantage of God's people. They exploited them. And during the siege and the falling of the city, people ran. People ran from Jerusalem screaming, and the roads to Edom seeking safety. The Edomites would wait in ambush. They would take captive God's people who were fleeing, and they would bring them back to the Babylonians. And the most terrific and appalling thing of all that historians tell us was quite normal. This has happened in other parts of the Bible, and it's even happened in recent world history. We find that this happened in World War II to some people. We're told in verse 9 that when cities were sacked and looted, soldiers would come into the town and they would cause chaos. Specifically, they would find women who were holding their babies. They would take the babies, grab them by the feet, and dash them until they were dead. And this memory of violence and wicked and cruel atrocities of the sacking of the city, it happened to God's people. And it's preserved for us in the history by this psalm. Now you know the context. And it's hard, isn't it? We read it, and I can hardly say the words without feeling pain and rage and anger. And the average person would say, well, then why is it even in the Bible? Let alone in the Psalms, where this event, this constant reminder of what happened to God's people would be sung. And the reason is because this psalm helps us process tragedy. It helps us process tragic injustice in life. It's going to help us deal with anger in that moment. When mistreatment and when atrocities happen to us, it shows us how to respond. So we're going to look at this psalm. And as we look at it, I want to note 3 things that the psalmist does here that we need to take notice of. So firstly, we're going to see him admit his anger. Then he's going to pray it. And then he's going to confine it. And then we're going to finish by looking at what our response needs to be and how we learn from this psalm. So admit it, pray it, confine it. Let's start. In light of knowing the context, let me read verses 1 to 6 again. So the psalmist is writing, "By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept. When we remembered Zion, on the willows there we hung up our lyres. For there our captors required of us songs and our tormentors mirth, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. If I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy." We know this psalm is an eyewitness account, and we know it because of the way it's written. It's so vivid. It's as if he remembers every detail because of the experience he went through. He mentions they're in exile. They're not sitting where they used to sit. They're not sitting with the hills and the valleys of Judah around them. They're not sitting in Jerusalem. They're in a different place. They're in the waters of Babylon. And the psalmist mentions what the captors are doing to God's people. What are they doing? They're rubbing it in. They're taunting them. They're ridiculing them, making fun of Jerusalem. Verse 3 says, "Our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.'" They're making fun of the city that they took. They make fun of Jerusalem. They boasted of this city, this great city, Jerusalem, being the city of God, the one where salvation is found, where the truth of the world lies. And they say, "Hey, why don't you come sing us one of those songs? Why don't you sing us about a song about that God of yours, the one that we defeated?" You can imagine them pointing, couldn't you? Like, "Hey, you in chains, where's your God now? Hey, why don't you entertain us with how your God is so good to you? Hey, you building a wall, how about you sing us a song about how God, your great Yahweh, is the great God, the one and only God? Why don't we hear one of those tunes to entertain us?" They're taunting God's people. But note what the psalmist doesn't do. Look what he doesn't do in response. He doesn't admit defeat. He doesn't respond and say, "All right, I'll sing you a song." Verse 2 says, no, on the willows we hung up our lyres. That's a musical instrument. There's no way we're singing for you. Instead, we're going to put our instruments away. He doesn't become pessimistic. He just gets angry. He admits his anger. They hang up their instruments and they refuse to play them. Verse 4 says, how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let me not play anymore. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth so I can't sing. What's he doing? He's admitting that he's mad. And in an act of protest, he will not sing. There would have been huge consequences, I'm sure, for refusing to sing. The psalmist doesn't tell us what they are. I'm sure they were bad. But he just writes the psalm and says, I'm going to protest. There's no way you're going to hear any song come out of my mouth. I'm going to stay angry about the injustice that has happened to God's people. Is it okay for the psalmist to be angry? Now, that's an interesting question, isn't it? In some ways, we hear about what's happened and we're angry. I'm angry. In other ways, we think maybe we shouldn't be angry. And how can a psalm like this be sung in the presence of God's people? Sometimes we can't take the pain and the anger in this psalm. It's too much. Maybe we should just have thrown this psalm out of the Bible. Is it okay to sing that you're angry? In a way, I'm relieved to see this here, aren't you? I'm relieved to see that ancient people could admit that they were angry, because I know plenty of Christians who wouldn't admit they're angry when they are, or when they should be. Ancient people could call out injustice and say, this happened. I'm calling it out and I'm angry. See, the Bible's approach to anger doesn't feel like common sense to us sometimes, but it's actually okay to be angry. Ephesians 4:26 tells us to be angry, but not sin. Paul doesn't tell us to not be angry. He says, you can be angry, but don't sin. In Mark 3, Jesus was being watched by the Pharisees in the synagogue on the Sabbath to see if he was going to heal a man with a withered hand, and they wanted to accuse him. And so Jesus tells the man to come, and he asks the Pharisees, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or harm, to save life or kill? And they were silent. And listen to this. Mark 3:5 says this. He looked at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and then said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out and the hand was restored. Jesus is filled with anger at them and heals. Jesus, the one who has committed no sin, was angry. So it's okay to be angry. It's okay to be angry at injustice, at mistreatment, at tragedy. In fact, it would be sinful to deny that you're angry. If you don't admit and deal with your anger, anger will destroy you. It would be wrong to not be angry at times. Because the biblical understanding of anger is, here's a definition for you, passion expressed towards something bad that is a danger to something good. And so if something bad is a danger to something good, we should be angry. As Christians, we should get angry that peace can turn to conflict, that life can be turned to death, that Christians are killed for loving Jesus. Because if we don't get angry at things that become a danger to something good, we aren't being like Jesus. And this psalmist says, I'm admitting my anger. But the next thing he does, though, is he prays it. He doesn't push his anger down. He doesn't not deal with it. Nor does he pretend that his anger doesn't exist. He doesn't air it out for everyone to see. The anger he has in the first 6 verses builds and builds and builds, but then it explodes in verse 7. But it explodes not into venting or airing it out or pretending that his anger is not there. When he gets to verse 7, the psalmist begins to pray his anger and he says, remember. Lord, would you remember? He takes his anger to God and he processes it in front of God, in God's presence. He takes his feelings and his emotions and he brings them to the throne room of grace. He opens them up in all of their brutal and honest reality and he brings them to God in all of God's reality. See, the way to deal with our anger is not to stifle our feelings. It's not to pretend that you don't have feelings about what you're going through. It's not to air it out and go nuts so that everyone will hear it. The psalm says none of those things, but it says, pray it. Pray your feelings. Bring your reality of what you're feeling with God's reality. And when the psalmist does this, we see that God's reality changes his feelings, and it changes ours. This is what happens with the psalmist. He admits his anger, he prays his anger, and then he confines it, or he limits it, or he contains it. It may not seem that way when you read verses 7 and 9, but he does. So what do I mean by this? The psalmist doesn't do what Hollywood would do. The psalmist doesn't do what other history books would do. We would expect verses 5 to 6 to say, let my right hand forget its skill, let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth. With God as my witness, I'm going to kill every last Babylonian for what they've done to me. But he doesn't say it. He says, remember. God, remember. Here's what we need to know to understand what's happening when the psalmist is saying, remember. It's a prayer, but it also means something else. See, this word remember in our context means to not forget. But in Hebrew, it doesn't mean not forget. It actually means do something. So when the psalmist says remember, he's actually saying to God, God, would you do something? And this means, by the way, that word remember in this psalm, every commentator says this, it has a courtroom setting. So it's not just the psalmist airing out his feelings, actually saying, I'm in a courtroom. God, you are judge. Here's the facts. Verse 7, the Edomites, they were chanting, lay it bare, down to its foundations. They were rooting for us to be destroyed. Verse 9, the Babylonians dashed our little ones against the rock. God, this all happened to your people, your chosen people, so remember. Do something. Give justice. The psalmist here is reminding himself that God is judge, not him. And he asks the judge to remember and to do something. Here's my anger. This is what's happened to me. This is what's happened to your people. God, do something. So we need to go to God with our anger. And we need to remind ourselves that God is the one. God is the one person in the whole world who is the judge and has the power to judge and is the one who promises to make things right. This psalmist took his anger to God and confined it, you see. He didn't say, God, let me destroy them. He confines his anger and he says, God, I give it to you, the just judge. So is the anger gone? Of course not. But he's taken it to God. And he's asked God to be the judge. So his anger isn't going to burn him up anymore. He's not going to be poisoned with his feelings toward those who have wronged him anymore. He gives his anger to God. There's a Croatian man who you may have heard of. He's still alive. His name is Miroslav Volf. He's a theologian and a pastor. He's written a number of books, but he wrote this book in the 90s called Exclusion and Embrace. And this explores how the gospel actually needs to and does address hatred of others when wrong is done to you, when injustice is done to you. Miroslav Volf's background was working with people in the Cold War throughout the 20th century, and so he has a lot of experience in this area. And in his book, he summarizes what it's like to give your feelings to God. He says, if you've ever been a victim of violence, you know you want to respond with violence. You will not be able to forgive unless you have an incredibly powerful confidence that there is a God who put all things right. A God who will ensure that perfect justice is given. And he's right. This is what we need to do. We need to bring our anger into the presence of God, who, as the Apostles' Creed tells us, will come to judge the living and the dead. I just find it astounding, don't you, that the psalmist just doesn't say, God, I'll kill them all. This is why we know the psalmist is confining his anger, because he doesn't say that. He says, God, you're judge, not me. What he does ask, though, for in his justice is verse 8. We see this. He says, blessed shall he be who repays you with what you've done to us. So what he's saying there is he wants the same suffering that he's experienced to be put on his enemies. That's interesting. Is it wrong for the psalmist's prayer to be that the offenders are repaid the same thing that he has experienced? That's an interesting question to explore. Because I think the psalmist did exactly what he should have done. He admits his anger, he prays his anger, he confines his anger, he appeals to God as judge to dish out to the enemies what was done to him. But at the same time, for you and I, it would actually be right for us to admit our anger, yes, to pray our anger, to confine our anger, but it would be wrong for us to ask God to repay our enemies with the same thing they did to us. Now, how can that be? The reason is because we have to consider the context of this psalm. We know something the psalmist didn't know. We can do something the psalmist couldn't do. We see the Messiah clearly from the scriptures and we know it's Jesus, but the psalmist didn't. And it does make a difference. So let me explain. If you go to the Gospels, in Luke 19, there's this famous passage of Jesus and his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. It's Palm Sunday, the week leading up to Jesus' death and resurrection. Do you remember what Jesus does as he draws near to Jerusalem? It's only found in the Gospel of Luke. He weeps. He cries. And he starts saying, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, if you only knew. Let me read Luke 19, 41 to 44. When he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes. For the day will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and dash you to the ground, you and your children within you. They will not leave one stone upon another in you because you did not know the time of your visitation. As Jesus walks into Jerusalem, he thinks of this psalm, Psalm 137, of what happened to God's people. But more than this, this is the only time the word dashed is used in the New Testament. But more than this again, he's prophesying that it's going to happen again. It's going to happen in Jerusalem again. And it does. In AD 70, under the reign of Emperor Titus. Not one stone will be left on the other. And again, you and your little ones will be dashed to the ground. Jerusalem will fall again. But isn't it remarkable that as Jesus is walking into the city that is about to kill him, that is about to reject him, that he doesn't wish for God to repay them for what they're going to do? Isn't that remarkable? Oh, what's that? Is that me? We okay? That was a weird noise. Okay. It's remarkable that Jesus walks into the city that's about to kill and reject him, and he doesn't wish for God to repay them for what they're going to do to him. As he walks to Jerusalem, instead, he weeps. As he heads to the city that will destroy him, he doesn't say, oh, you're going to get what's coming to you. For what you're about to do to me, you're going to get yours. He doesn't say it. He doesn't gloat. He weeps. If you only knew. But it's hidden from your eyes. And on the cross, as Jesus is dying, he doesn't look at his killers and say, you'll get yours. I wish for you what you've done to me. He doesn't say it. What does he say? Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them. How can you explain that Jesus would respond in such a way? Is it that Jesus doesn't care for justice? Where's his anger? It's okay to be angry. Where's his anger? This psalm is so emotionally moving, it makes you cry out for justice. The eyewitness who wrote this psalm would have seen things that we don't bear to see. He would have seen his family and his friends dashed to pieces. Shouldn't someone pay for that? What's Jesus' answer? His answer is not, well, go and seek justice. Go and get yours. Go and get their little ones. Repay them for what they did to you. He doesn't say it. God the Father, the judge, says, of course that has to be paid for. But my son Jesus was taken from heaven and brought to earth, and he was dashed, and he was destroyed, and he did that voluntarily, and God let him. Because yes, the sin needs to be paid for. But instead of you dishing out vengeance and repaying evil for evil, or asking me to repay evil for evil, instead Jesus is just going to take it. God says, I lost my son because of this debt. And someone does have to pay it. But taking it out on them won't work. Me giving them the same thing that they gave you won't work, because relationship needs to be restored. And God reconciles it all because he let his son be dashed and killed. So you don't have to look for anyone else's kids to be dashed and killed. It's powerful, isn't it? I want to finish by telling a story from Corrie ten Boom's book, The Hiding Place. I see Corrie ten Boom lived this. She worked against the Nazis in World War II, and she hid Jews in her home. When she was caught, she was sent to a concentration camp where she was stripped of her dignity. She saw her father and her sister die. Her sister's name was Betsy. That comes into the story. And she suffered more at the hands of other people than we could possibly imagine. Well, after the war ended, Corrie ten Boom was preaching at different churches, and she was sharing her story. And she encountered one of her jailers that she was speaking at a church service in Munich one day. And this is what she writes of that day. It was a church service in Munich that I saw him, the former SS man who stood guard at the shower door in the processing centre at Ravensbrück. He was the first of our actual jailers that I had seen since the war. And suddenly it was all there, the room full of mocking men, the heaps of clothing, my sister Betsy's pain-blanched face. He came up to me as the church was emptying, beaming and bowing. How grateful I am for your message, Fräulein, he said. To think that, as you say, he has washed my sins away. His hand was thrust out to shake mine. And I, who preach so often to the people the need to forgive, kept my hand at my side. Even as the angry, vengeful thoughts boiled through me, I saw the sin of them. Jesus Christ had died for this man. Was I going to ask for more? Lord Jesus, I prayed, forgive me and help me to forgive him. I tried to smile. I struggled to raise my hand. I couldn't. I felt nothing, not the slightest spark of warmth or charity. And so again, I breathed a silent prayer. Jesus, I cannot forgive him. Give me your forgiveness. As I shook his hand, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder, along my arm, and through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for the stranger that almost overwhelmed me. And so I discovered that it is not on our forgiveness anymore, that on our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on his. When he tells us to love our enemies, he gives, along with the command to love itself. Sisters and brothers, because of Jesus' death and resurrection on the cross, we can forgive. You can forgive someone who has wronged you in such a way as to admit your anger, pray your anger, and confine it. And then you can give your anger to Jesus so it doesn't kill you. And you can forgive, knowing that when you see them, you'll want to be cruel to them, but you'll be kind. You'll not talk about them behind their back or desire for them to suffer. And you'll be able to do it because Jesus forgave you of your sin. Why don't we pray? God, we need your help. We need your help in grasping how to deal with anger in a healthy and godly way. We admit this is tough. We see the answers in Scripture and the need to forgive, but it doesn't make it easy. Lord, would you make what Jesus has done on the cross a reality in our hearts so that we can move forward beyond confining our anger, so that it would just change us into a people that longs for and fights for justice. Lord, place love in our hearts for people who have wronged and mistreated us. And would you make us more like Jesus? I pray this for our sake and for your glory. Amen.